Welcome, everybody. My name is Jill Jonathan, and I'm with Red Wine and Blue. We are a community of women who use digital media and friend-to-friend organizing to change the world one suburb at a time. Today, we are going to be talking about extremism in our own backyards. So I am so excited. I will have Joe, as in JoJo from Jers, as always, joining. And then I'm going to have another mom from Jersey as well, Caitlin.
Hi.
Hello, welcome. So, two Jersey moms today. How exciting!
Look out. Look out. Look out. There's going to be trouble. That much I can pretty much guarantee. Just kidding. Um, you know, I'm excited to talk to Caitlin. I've spoken to her recently. I was introduced to her by an old friend who called out something that was happening right around the corner for me. She reached out to me and made me aware of something because I talk all the time. We talk about all the time about paying attention to what is happening in your own backyard, right? Like in particular, as it relates to school boards. And here I was thinking I was paying attention, only to find out, again, thanks to my old friend, that just a few towns over, in a town like so many other American towns, right wing extremists had taken over the board and were poised to and have since removed a book. Right in my own backyard. So I wanted to talk to Caitlin, who ran for board there in Sparta in November. She says she's just a mom, but we all know there's no just in front of that word, mom. But Caitlin's story, it's a story for all of us. I think it's a universal evergreen story of what's happening in America, in school boards, all over the country. People wouldn't necessarily associate this kind of extremism with New Jersey, and they're wrong. So, with that said, I guess we'll just introduce her, Caitlin Gagnon, right? It's not the French pronunciation. They pointed out to me. Welcome.
If you want to go for it, Joe, you're more than welcome.
I would have assumed just for whatever reason that the G was silent and it was Gannon, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's Gagnon. Welcome.
Thank you so much to both of you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, Caitlin, so glad that you were able to join us. And when Joe, heard about what was going on at your school district, she was like, "Oh my gosh, it's like in my own backyard." And I'm like, "Yeah, it's happening everywhere. It's like I know it's happening where I live in Ohio." And so it's just something that we need to keep talking about. So we're really happy that you were able to join us today. So thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate it very much.
Let's start with the book. So
Yes.
the book is The Upside of Unrequited by Becky Albertalli. Essentially, the central theme of the book is a teenage girl trying to be comfortable in her own skin. So why don't we start there?
Yes, I agree. So it's very interesting because one of the main issues that came about, or let me just explain essentially what we're enduring so everyone kind of understands. So again, I live in Sparta, New Jersey. And most recently, a few weeks back, a parent in our district submitted a complaint about that book to the superintendent and the Board of Education, which is, totally within anyone's right. But it's a book that is part of a series. It's known for having diverse characters and LGBTQ characters and themes, especially. But this book was available to the eighth graders through our middle school library. It was not part of any curriculum, nothing like that. And a complaint was submitted. And in accordance with our district policy, as a result of the complaint, the book was brought to a confidential committee of 7 individuals, including a library staff member, district department heads, a principal for our schools, a community member, a board member. So really, a diverse enough group to be able to assess the text impartially. At least, I believe that. So that committee voted 5-2 after reviewing the book in favor of keeping that book as it was in our middle school, limited to eighth graders. And at the most recent board meeting a week ago, the Sparta Board of Education rejected that committee's findings and demanded to have the book moved to the high school the very next day.
And this is sort of like, I guess you could more or less have seen this coming, right? So there's some backstory here.
Yes.
With the temperature in Sparta. Why don't you explain that a little bit?
Well, in terms of the book, this book isn't the first or the last. It's, I would say, the most formal in terms of how the process which was followed, which, there's a lot to say there, but the process was followed. A complaint was submitted, a committee was formed, and, by the books, or at least by policy, that process specifically was followed. Now, the board rejecting the committee's findings, that's where it turns into kind of a gray area, obviously. But the major issue, at least for me and for those of us who are so concerned, is that this book isn't the first or the last. So coming out of COVID, there was a similar book complaint, which just took place over email correspondence. But that was over a book called Ghost Boys, which has, absolutely been in the news. It was reported to be anti-cop. Having read that book, I completely disagree. And then there was another complaint. I guess I wouldn't call it a complaint, though, because it was very informal. It was really just, a bunch of people kind of took over a board meeting and went off about a book called Queer, and even targeted a teacher because he had it on his online reading list, a recommended reading list of diverse content, because people found the content inappropriate. And he ended up resigning as a result of that, or I shouldn't say as a result, but certainly one of the reasons why he ended up resigning. And this is why I think this whole issue just matters so much to me and to others in our district, is that, it's very obvious that there is some sort of a crusade happening here. And what we can attribute that to definitely fluctuates, but it seems like that this is not the first, it's not the last. And I'm afraid of the slippery slope that we're quickly speeding down, and what that's going to look like for my children, for other children in our district, and, for public education itself.
Right. And you talked about how, I mean, let's just talk a little bit about this idea that the people on this board who are extremists, that 6 of the 9 of them ran in November under this Students First banner, right? So,
Correct.
like, right, when obviously that's the upside down, right? It's not students first, it's not parents' rights at all. In fact, it's the opposite. These are a handful of people who are trying to basically overrule both experts in the field, the people who vetted these books, and teachers. So it's
Absolutely.
not students first, it's not parents first, right? And we're seeing this all over the country. Jill's seeing it in Ohio too. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So the one thing that I will say, and I actually said this at the meeting last week, we actually have a student liaison to the board, and he sits at the board, along with the board at the meetings. And he's only been there for a few months now, but he's excellent, very, very vocal, involved. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I certainly was not involved in anything at all regarding school boards when I was in high school. I was not doing that by any means. So it was ironic because as he went to go, kind of give his opinion on the matter, which certainly seemed to be of the mindset that, in 8th grade, we are absolutely exposed to this content already. There's discussions, there's, peer discussions, there's I think even brought up Euphoria as a great example of, the type of content that we're already exposed to. And the members of that board basically told him he wasn't allowed to speak during that time, which did seem like a formality. He ended up having to stand up and walk off of the board and come join us during public comment to be able to voice his opinion. But I said, what a perfect indication of students first. We're literally not allowing a student to offer their insight because it isn't in alignment with this mission. But either way, that's more of a side note, but, definitely an interesting, I don't know if I want to call it hypocrisy, but just maybe painful irony. But either way, so in terms of the campaign, yes, I ran on a slate of 6. We were 6 candidates running. For our campaign slogan was advocating for all, and we were doing everything in our power to really uphold that mission. There were actually 17 candidates for our school board this election season. And first of all, I just have to say, if you're going to run for the school board, I definitely recommend, thick skin, maybe like a helmet, because I was called names and accused of things that I don't think, 33 years of life, there were a lot of firsts, but it was definitely a lot of a learning experience. It was definitely interesting. But either way, so during the campaign, we really began to notice a lot of parallels between the pro parental rights movement and the candidates that were running and outside influence groups. So the slate was endorsed and supported financially by our county's GOP, which was, for an apolitical entity, you can argue that that's not really kosher, but either way, that happens in politics, that happens in campaign runs. You can't really help who endorses you on some level. But more concerning to us was groups like the New Jersey Project and Chaos and Control. And we came to discover that members of slate and their supporters were actually working with these groups. And yes, they were endorsed by these groups, but tagging one another on group pages and engaging in discussions that were just very concerning. So these groups have since, they're taking credit for having their candidates elected to school boards across New Jersey. They're continuing those campaigns for the upcoming election. They're featured on Fox News. And I personally find their messages and their mission to be deeply, deeply concerning.
Caitlin, like I was saying, I live in Ohio and we've seen the same thing. And I'm just would curious to learn a little bit more about this group, Chaos and Control, which is a very interesting name. And it's terrifying because, like you said, like they didn't stop at the 2022 election. It sounds like they're just moving to more territory and looking to the future. And like from your observation, what is their mission and what do you think that they're trying to do exactly?
So from what I have gathered in following them to some capacity while trying to preserve my mental health is that it's definitely a pro-parental rights movement, which I take issue with in the sense that me personally, I think any parent, when you hear the term parental rights, it seems like a non-compete. That's obviously a good thing. We want to make sure that as parents, we are protecting our children and we're choosing what's right and what's best for our children as much as we can. But the notion that we are engaged in some sort of a war or that we're under attack as parents, I think is really contributing to a lot of the division that we're seeing in our state, our district, but our country. This is definitely something that is trending. To your point, Jill, it's not exclusive to New Jersey. But in terms of these two groups, I consider what they're doing to be, I've called it a campaign of like fear and mis and disinformation. Because really, from what I've seen, it's using fear tactics to convince the public and parents especially that there is some sort of a war being waged, and really they perpetuate those claims with pretty radical disinformation. And what I mean when I say about, there's this kind of umbrella of the issues that they're trying to target. Masks are a big one. They're not very fond of Phil Murphy, which is, totally subjective and fine, I guess. But also access to books with LGBTQ content. There seems to be a real denial of the fact, and I say fact, to mimic one of my favorites, Neil deGrasse Tyson, like the fact that people identify themselves on a spectrum of gender. There seems to be this kind of denial of that fact. And now we're in a position where, if you're aligning with their mentality or the rationale that they're using, if you support access to books or freedom of gender expression or access to family life or sex education, or if you supported masking, back when it was mandated, well, then you're a sheep, you're a groomer, you're a pedophile, or you're a woke teacher. And I just think that that is about as divisive and problematic a rationale as you can have. Mm-hmm. And I also think that, from what we learned, especially, or what I learned in my experience with campaigning, being pro-parent shouldn't mean that you have to be anti-teacher or anti-anything for that matter. It just, there's no one size fits all approach to parenting. And I think that having options that allow parents to explore whatever that, the best path is, I think that's really where our rights as parents are protected and are upheld. So I'm just not buying into this, the war campaign that this we should leave our houses in fear that every person is trying to indoctrinate our children with, history or reality. I'm having a lot of trouble navigating it.
Yeah. And we see this campaign on a national scale, right? I mean, it's clear that this is what Republicans are sort of gearing up for as their messaging for going into 2024. But the thing is, and the thing that's like so mind-blowing is that while it seems, it's a national problem and it's not happening like right here, maybe it's not happening in my town because it's not happening in my town. But the thing is, it's literally happening right around the corner, and it's happening in so many towns like yours. And the
Right.
idea, it really is, it is a messaging war because they are using these terms that they know will trigger parents, because what we all want to take care of our kids, we all want to protect our kids, right? We all want to ensure our parental rights, and they are framing this as some change, that there's some new attack on parents' rights, when of course the opposite is the case. They don't want parental rights, they want the right to parent everyone else's kids. They want to control what my child has access to, what your child, Jill's children, what they have access to in school. And one of the things in particular that scares me, and I watched your board meeting, which we can share probably in our Twitter account. But it's amazing because someone spoke up and spoke about the value of young adult novels, and one of the most important things about these books is that these young adults can see themselves reflected in literature. Not only that, but there are young adults who can see other people reflected in literature. And the power of that cannot be overstated. And so the idea that a few people, a select group of people, can come in and decide that all of the children and all of the students and all of the young adults in a school cannot access this material is certainly not parental rights or students first.
Joe, it's so interesting that you said that, because something that I've kept repeating throughout this process in hopes of like providing some insight. So I mean, for the most part, I was more inclined to be in honors and AP classes, but I remember vividly it had to have been, I think it was seventh grade honors. But of Mice and Men is a banned book in some capacity, right? And reading that book in seventh or eighth grade completely radically changed my life. It is hands down probably why I'm a writer today. But I remember vividly kids in my class absolutely hating it and like, I didn't finish it, it was awful, or what a boring ending, or whatever it was. And I just remember it resonating so much with me, and I think that was the first time I really realized how subjective reading is and how intimate that process is, in the sense of what resonates so wholeheartedly for me might be something that one man's trash is another man's treasure, right? So just because one person sees no value in a text or a book, it could still be a book that easily saves another person's life. And I'm just of the mentality that limiting access to any book is a problem for that very reason, because of how subjective that value is. And, not to mention that the majority of the books, at least that we're seeing now, especially The Upside, these are books that are meant to provide empathy for the marginalized. So, this book has been in our library. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it's been in our middle school library since 2017. So it's like, why now? What happened now that now this book is, suddenly so controversial and suddenly so, riddled with content that is so inappropriate. And to me, what's happened now is, we have websites like Book Looks that are perpetuated by Moms for Liberty and similar groups that are trying to warn parents to look out for books and look out for content in books that frankly have been sitting on library shelves for longer than I've had kids, so I think this is where that, the clarity of that campaign and that mission really comes in, and how important it is for us as parents to understand that if we don't, and I hate to use the word fight, but if we don't push back or at least press on why this is happening, it's going to get a lot worse before it ever gets better.
That's such an important point. And just to add there, it's a coordinated effort on the part of the bands and the extremism. It's and Moms for Liberty and all of the subgroups, Chaos and Control and New Jersey Project, et cetera, et cetera. It's clearly a well coordinated effort, and the response has to be well coordinated, right? And that's why these conversations are so important. That's why what you're doing and bringing this to light and calling attention to what's happening in your town is so important, because we together, as a coalition of not just moms and suburban moms, and definitely not just moms in New Jersey and Ohio, but people all over the country can see what's happening and can fight again. The framework is definitely, it's unfortunate, but it is where we're at. But fight against what they're doing, because that's what we have to do, and together we have to do it together so that we can be stronger in number, and in power to combat this, because it isn't going to just go away.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Joe. I mean, it isn't going to go away, and I would just suggest that people stay vigilant, because I know in the 2021 elections in the school district my kids are in, didn't go the way that we had hoped it would. And now we're seeing extremism on the school board. And I have friends like in other school districts, they're like, well, ours turned out pretty well. And I'm like, this time, but seriously, stay vigilant, because you don't know. And then, Caitlin, I just want to touch on a point. With this book, they removed it from the 8th grade, but as they're saying, but it's still in the high school. So high school students still have access to it. We're just removing it from 8th graders. And I would just love to hear your thoughts on that, because I've read some things where people are like, we're not banning the book, we're just moving it up a grade. So what are your thoughts on that?
I appreciate that for sure. Bringing light to that point. So, I mean, I have a few thoughts, but I think number one is that it was a complete slap in the face to our professionals. It um, follows a sort of recurring theme that we're seeing play out, where parents and even now elected officials on the board are subverting the actual process of public education and the people who have dedicated their lives or careers to it. There was a committee put in place. That committee voted, granted not unanimously, but again, 2 members dissenting when one of those members was a board member. We know. I don't know personally who the board member is, because the group was meant to be confidential, although it does seem that some people have access to or have alluded to the fact that they know who's on this confidential committee, which is obviously problematic. So number one, I think it was a total slap in the face to the committee. That being said, I also think, to take it a step further, in the reasoning, one of the board members actually provided a reason during the meeting and said, and this is a quote, but it had nothing to do with specific content as much as policy, because the book is recommended by the author for grades 9 through 12 and ages 14 to 18. And I think that speaks volumes, when a board member is saying, well, I'm removing it or moving it up a grade because I feel, it's, again, we're dealing with a subjective opinion in lieu of a professional opinion, or in lieu of what is the typical process, which is upholding a committee's findings. Now, again, the board isn't bound by committee's findings, but you kind of have to have some really good reasoning behind you to subvert that process that was ironically, put in place through board policy. So without a reason, we're kind of left with this open door now where, okay, so any parent with a problem, instead of emailing the librarian and saying, hey, I on a personal family level, this book isn't appropriate for my child, I am asking you to not allow my child access to this book, which I would hope to believe that every librarian receiving that email would uphold and understand and respect. We're dealing with parental rights, right? Choice. Instead of that, we've now opened the door to, if you have a problem or find a book offensive, send us an email. And whether the committee agrees or disagrees, we can go ahead and do whatever we want if we think on a personal, opinionated level that it's, not in the best interest of our child or our students. And I think that's where such, the biggest concern lies, is again, this isn't the first and it's probably not the last. It's been about 60 days. And so far, and I don't mean to sound disgruntled because, I've said from the beginning, I lost fair and square. I have accepted that fact. I am rooting for this board, like any other board, to succeed, because if they fail, it hurts my children. But in 60 days, we've watched them, have this happen last week. At their swearing in ceremony, they were demanding teachers' lesson plans, which thankfully didn't, end up happening. They've asked to remove live streaming for the general public for parents and teachers that can't make it to these meetings. And now, even beyond it, it just seems like we're following such a clear trend of, this movement to combat this, war that I just don't see. I just don't see it. And I think that's where we're at. If we don't do something now, um, I don't want it to look like Florida bookshelves, where there's 5 books and it's the books that a handful of people determine are appropriate for my children.
Right. I have so many questions, but number one I wanted to start with, again, going back to, I watched the board meeting, and there were a lot of people who stood up and spoke out in support of this book and not having it removed from the school. And something we talk a lot about at Red, Wine, and Blue is meeting people where they are in terms of how involved they feel comfortable getting with their activism, right? Some people are more comfortable staying in the shadows and just being supportive. Some people are more comfortable getting up there and putting themselves out there. Some people are really getting in the dirt like you, exposing yourself to such vitriol. And I'm sorry about that. I get it. God knows I get it. And getting out there and actually running. So I guess a couple of layers to that question. In terms of just like any advice you would give for somebody who maybe wants to speak up at their local board meeting, like, and they might be scared, what piece of advice would you give them?
So this is a great one because I vividly remember, like, I first started getting involved on the school board level when COVID first hit, and my youngest was in kindergarten, and we were all, navigating this really intimidating, scary, uncharted territory. And it's definitely intimidating in terms of, you're holding elected officials, at least you're participating in the process, but in some cases, absolutely go and speak positively when you can and give credit where it's due always. But a lot of times we find that, people are holding elected officials accountable, and sometimes, that's a necessary process or part of democracy. But I think the best advice I could give, aside from putting yourself out there and running, which, it's a learning experience, definitely, for sure, and a positive one, and totally worth it. It's really eye-opening, and it was amazing in terms of, my children, and for them to kind of understand the just our obligation to society in terms of standing up and speaking out. I'm a firm believer in, walking the walk. So definitely, that's an amazing thing to do. But it doesn't require, running is not the only option by any stretch of the imagination. So I like to say, advocate for your children, whatever that looks like. So show up to meetings and listen. Just listen to start. You don't have to speak, but showing up and asserting your presence and your role in this process as a taxpayer, as a parent, is really empowering for sure. Speak if there is something that matters to you that you feel the need to speak to. Sometimes, I go and I have no intention of speaking and I end up speaking, or sometimes I go and I have specific things I want to discuss and they end up becoming an email at a later date. So, allow kind of your heart and your compass to guide you in that process. But again, if you have it in you, by all means, run for the board if you can muster that courage, and knowing that you might totally lose, and that's okay. Because your children are watching, and beyond that too, I would say, these groups that we've discussed, they have recognized that the school board on a local level is probably the easiest elected position to infiltrate. And I really think that's what they've done and are doing here. And I also think, this is probably like the biggest moral of my story and the biggest takeaway. Joe, you had said earlier, like I had told you, I'm just a mom, because I'm so rooted in believing that I am not an activist. I commend you guys for all you do, but I am not an activist by any stretch of the imagination. I am a mom, and I care deeply about my kids, and I care deeply about public education, because growing up in the household I did with a single parent, my father raised me, it meant a lot to me to be able to sit in a library and feel understood and feel heard and validated. And a lot of my validation came from books, and it has inspired the trajectory of my life in a lot of ways. So that being said, I think it's just time that for us as parents, those of us who exist on a political spectrum of, left and right and moderate middle, it really is time for us all to band together and just denounce the extremism. Because at this point, I believe it's safe to say that our country's had enough. And while we're battling culture wars and doing all of these things that we're up, taking on all of these things that we're up against, there are actual real issues that are falling to the wayside on local, state, and federal levels. And I mean, our district, for example, like, we desperately need a new elementary school. We're overcrowded. Our teachers are leaving and facing like low morale. It's terrible. And again, our board has spent the last 60 days, doing what they've done. So I say, speak to those issues if you don't feel comfortable speaking to the culture war talking points. If there's something going on in your district that's concerning you, that's more important, that deserves our attention, that deserves, your opinion and your feedback, then start there. But again, to me, these issues, it goes beyond the surface. It's not just a single book being moved up. It's the book is almost like the metaphor. And I just think whatever you can do in your capacity to, find compromise with people who are similarly tired of just, screaming into the void in the middle, feeling like we're torn between these levels of extremism that aren't serving anyone.
Caitlin, that is so well said, and I 100% agree. And you touched on so many things that my personal community is dealing with as well. And like you said, with the board meetings, you don't have to give a public comment, but showing up can mean a big thing. And then also, I like how you were talking about, if you're not comfortable, talking about the extremism, talk about the actual needs of the school, which is almost even better in a way, because it's bringing it back to what a school board is actually supposed to be doing. Because these culture wars or whatever, book banning, it's just a distraction from what actually needs to be done to make public education great. So I really appreciate you saying that. And I just want to touch on something before we wrap up, because like Joe and I were talking about this, the public opinion, it sounds like the majority of people don't want this book to be removed. So I encourage people to find other like-minded people. And I'll be honest, it took me a while in my community, but I got connected with a group where we're all like, we really just want what's best for our kids. So we do show up at the board meetings together. We do sometimes have like a common theme of what we're going to say at the board and just sit together. We have stickers that say, I support the school district, different things like that, like finding, other people that are thinking the way you think, because I do think it's a majority of us don't want to see public education go in this direction. So, Caitlin, do you have anything to just add to that before we wrap up?
No, I mean, the only thing I would say is that I completely agree. And, even if you're not speaking, just being there to support, I keep saying, our teachers really need us during this time. And it's not just about, again, being pro parental right doesn't have to mean that you're anti teacher. So you can advocate for your children. You can advocate for yourself as a parent and a taxpayer again. But I do think that we need to make sure that we're putting a clear message out to the teachers who are, and I said this at the meeting, undermined and underpaid, right? They need to know that they have support in this process, that we respect the fact that they spend a huge chunk of their day and their year with our children. And I think that just bringing it back to kind of the, you hate to say it this way, but the more old fashioned way that parents used to look at teachers, where it was an equally respected process. People respected teachers more and respected their roles more. And I think now, as teachers navigate, this post-COVID world, and we have these other issues, like you hate to say it, but guns issues and other issues that they're faced with on a daily basis. I think the last thing that they need to feel is undermined by parents that are really supposed to be working in tandem with them. So I would just say, do anything you can, and whatever that looks like is good. It's just necessary at this point. And again, if you see it start, just don't don't believe for a minute that it won't happen in my town. Because when my husband and I drove through this town, and I think it was 2017, we didn't even tour the buildings. We were so confident with the research we had done, and driving through the town and driving by the schools, we thought, yep, this is it. This is where we will be. This is where our kids will be raised. And I never in a million years thought we'd be in this position, given how, esteemed our district is in our county. But here I am. So just advocate for your children, advocate for your teachers. And again, protect your rights, make sure you have options. But as long as you have options, recognize that don't buy into the I hate to say it, but the propaganda. Just don't buy into it. We have bigger issues at hand. So. But I thank you guys so much for having me. It's been, like I said, it's been heavy, but I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I appreciate you guys listening.
You said something that really resonated with me, and probably resonated with a lot of people listening, about being a mom, being a parent, right? So at the end of the day, we talk about a lot of the things that sort of bring us together and tie us together, and instead of dividing us. And one of those things is, at the end of the day, this isn't about my child or your child or a child in some other district in some other state. This is about all our children, and that they all feel safe, and that they all feel seen. And providing access to books like The Upside of Unrequited does exactly that. So I think that we can all agree that a safe environment for our kids is better for all of them, whether or not a book like that resonates with them personally, or whether or not reading a book like that makes them see somebody else in a different light than they may not have otherwise. Either way, in any case, it just makes for a more inclusive and safe environment for all our kids. And speaking of The Upside of Unrequited, we are very, very excited to be announcing that we will be talking on Instagram Live with the author next week. Jill, when is it?
I think it's March 16th.
March 16th. So we are so excited, because we want to talk about this ban in Sparta, and how this is not the only place where this book has been banned or removed from school libraries. And Becky Albertalli will be talking to us live. And I'm just really excited to have that conversation. Unfortunately, we have a lot of conversations with banned book authors. It is a lot of publishers say that their bench is very deep in that regard. But I'm personally very grateful that you brought this to my attention, that I was introduced to you, that this was something I was made aware of, because it's not happening in my town at the moment, but it is happening in a town I grew up right next to, one that I know very, very well. I know people who live there, and it really hit home. This one is personal for me, and I'm sure if we don't check this now, we'll all have those stories sooner or later. So the more we talk about them, the more we bring attention to them, the more we can combat them and change them and stop them. So personally, thank you for everything you're doing. And you may not know, Jill said it to me in a DM, you may not know you're an activist, but you are.
Welcome, Caitlin.
Well, I'll put it at the very bottom of my resume, because I certainly don't want that to be no, but I do appreciate it. And like I said, when it comes to my boys, I'm just, if that makes me an advocate, then so be it. But again, I feel like it's, the onus is on us as parents to find that middle ground, and just to, I hate it to say it, but to cut the crap. Enough is enough. Let everyone, do what's best for their family and respect it. But stripping those rights in the process is certainly not serving anybody. So I totally agree. I appreciate you guys for giving me this opportunity. I'm glad we were connected, for sure. And I would just say that when you speak with Becky, please tell her, thank you. And I'm super happy to hear that she's going to be on board. And I'd love to hear her take on the rationale that, the moving up of the book based on the author's recommendation. I'm really curious to hear what she has to say about that. So
yeah, that'll be a great question. And my kids just came home from school and have found me.
Duty calls. See that? You're no
They're
activist.
both like, hey.
No.
I'm like, okay, just a minute. Give me 2 more minutes. So,
ladies, thank you so much.
Oh my gosh. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And just please go to our website, redwine.blue. We'll keep you in the know. We'll keep you inspired to keep going because it's going to take all of us. So thanks for joining. Have a great afternoon. And I guess I'll see what my kids are up to. Bye, everybody.
Bye, all. Thank you.